Before colonization, the peoples of Eastern Africa tend to be one.
For thousands of years, men and women in this region have been trading with each other.
More and more scholars are talking about peaceful coexistence.
These two countries are joined at the hip, and many say also at the heart.
The economic prosperity and growth of a neighbor is the prosperity of Kenya.
The solution to East Africa is not secessionism, it's integration.
The Horn of Africa is a strategically vital part of the world. Since the digging of the Suez Canal, the Gulf of Aden has provided a crucial shipping route between the European powers and Asia. Britain in particular prized the region for creating access between the UK and India, considered for generations to be the jewel of the British Empire.
The British claimed that the reason they were interested in the region was because they wanted to be sure no power would have access to India. Because once they kicked out the French and everybody else from India, it was theirs. Then when the French constructed the Suez Canal, it became easy for other European powers to go to India without having got to go around the Cape. So they had to find their way into the canal. So that's the strategic argument. So now Somalia, being at the Horn, whether coming down the Mediterranean or getting to the Indian Ocean, that coastline is very, very, very strategic.
Contrary to the idea that there was no history before the advent of colonialism in this region or on this continent, there were trade routes, there were all kinds of human relationships, social relations, political relations. However, it would be very wrong of me to say that there was a Garden of Eden around this region or in Africa. I think people butchered themselves and fought like every other human being, but the ethnic differences have been brought by the post-colonial political economy of this region.
The Horn hosts a huge number of varied ethnic groups. Some are nomadic, others are settled and agrarian by tradition. The colonial borders generated stiff resistance among many of the local clans. Among others, there was compliance, even loyalty, to different colonial powers.
You had about three forces at play. You had the Ethiopians who were trying to go to the sea. Menelik had that dream of extending Ethiopian territory to the Indian Ocean. That was stopped by the British and the Italians. So they agreed that they would, Ethiopia would be stopped where it was, and then the Italians and the British will agree on that zone who takes what part. In the same way they agreed with the Germans, the southern border of what would become British East Africa. And those who are on the British side would have the British attributes. And you then have the issue of Jubaland, which used to be part of Kenya until 1925, and then was migrated to the Italian.
The scramble for Africa was largely commercial. In the late 19th century, ivory, rubber, animal hides and other merchandise were valued as raw materials for the manufacturing cities of Europe.
For thousands of years, men and women in this region have been trading with each other. I'll give you a specific example. Rinderprest was brought to Maasai land by Somalis from Kismayo because there was a trade route from Maasai land to Kismayo and all the way to the Gulf. They were giving meat to the Gulf countries.
The island town of Zanzibar was to become the most prosperous port between Suez and Durban. The Sultan of Zanzibar claimed 600 miles of coastline from Somaliland to Mozambique. But by the end of the 19th century, the entire region, including Zanzibar itself, had been carved up into different spheres of European interest. There were 5 outside powers competing to dominate the Horn: Britain, Germany, Italy, Ethiopia and Egypt. The first resistance came when Somalis sought to push the Ethiopians out of the Ogaden region, but they later turned their attention to Europeans as well. Mohammed Abdile Hassan, known by the British as the Mad Mullah, conducted a religious war against the Ethiopians and British for an entire generation from 1899 to 1920, when he was finally defeated.
He gave the British a very hard time, the British and the Italians. Before that, there were people here and there. But the fact that he organized resistance to the imposition of the new order. And it took some years of fighting before he was eventually subdued.
Italy maintained control of Italian Somaliland until 1941, but Britain took this over during World War II. While the Italians had invested seriously in developing their colony, Britain took a more hands-off approach.
One of the conditions for claiming a territory, colonial territory, is to impose what they said effective occupation. Effective occupation simply meaning beating up the people into submission. And once they submit, then you say you have it.
Meanwhile in Kenya, British settlers took greatest interest in the fertile highlands in the centre of the country. At the same time, they neglected the border area with Somalia, much as they had neglected Somalia itself.
In the case of the Kenya-Somalia border, there was some surveyor from London who came over here, looked around, and apparently when he returned back from the border region and he was sitting at the Norfolk having a bit of gin, his hand was shaking. And he had an assistant. He said, just draw a straight line down from the Ethiopia-Somali border to the Indian Ocean. And that line cut across communities. Same, not only ethnic, but clan, families.
There are many Somalis in Kenya, northern Kenya, who have got relatives, grandfathers, cousins across the border.
The minority tribes, Maasai, Samburu, Pokot and Somalis among them, were marginalised, particularly in the northeastern region, which was even designated off-limits to British women for security reasons.
Well, NFD was administratively never part of Kenya. The British somehow saw it as a buffer zone, and it saw the pastoral Somalis as a threat. It was a contained district. It had a special status. It was managed under emergency or rigid legislations. And until 1963, you couldn't travel from NFD to the rest of Kenya or vice versa unless you had a permit.
While much of Kenya hosted settled agrarian communities, most Somali clans were traditionally nomadic, roaming the territory around today's border. The notion of a national boundary separating territories ruled from faraway capital cities was and remains quite alien to the culture of the people who'd lived there for centuries.
After independence, the pastoralist communities, the Somalis and the Oromos, didn't feel part of Kenya. They were completely cut off. They had very little education. They had very little development. The first secondary school was only built in the 1970s. So when they were asked what they wanted, they looked toward Somalia and Ethiopia because of the similarities.
Well, you know, there was a referendum by the Four Powers Commission in northern Kenya, and they voted overwhelmingly to leave Kenya. The British government refused, and the administration of Jomo Kenyatta.
While in the rest of Kenya, we were celebrating the independence of a new African state, the people of NFD were at war with the new administration here, demanding to break away.
The stage was now set for armed conflict in the border area. The effort to unite the Somali people inside the boundaries of one Somali nation reached fever pitch.
Thousands of people lost their lives. The Northern Frontier District became a closed district under military occupation. It was a disaster for this country. And the repercussions of it have been continuing up to today.
Just the fact that every community in northern Kenya is divided, half in Somalia, half in Kenya, half in Ethiopia, still makes that border an albatross on the neck of whatever we want to do here.
Somali nationalism was symbolised by its flag, a five-pointed white star on a blue background representing the areas where ethnic Somalis had always lived. Djibouti, Somaliland, formerly occupied by the British, southern Somalia, formerly a colony of Italy, the Ogaden region of Ethiopia, and the northeastern province of Kenya. Under this banner, the so-called shifters, an informal militia hell-bent on claiming a sizable piece of Kenya for Somalia raided and butchered hundreds of members of other communities in the north of the country.
That was really the main war after Mau Mau. The point is, it touches on everything we believe in, the nation state, the geographical boundary, and then it pinned down the two protagonists, which is the Soviet Union against the West. And so it became much more complex than the simple boundary war. The Soviet Union arming Somalia, Ethiopia, and the West working together with Kenya. And so it became much more bloody than necessary.
Every night there was a curfew. You couldn't, after 6 o'clock, you were required to be in your home. Anyone found outside would be arrested, or you could even risk being killed for being suspected shifter. And all Somalis, regardless of their allegiance and where they lived, were considered suspects.
My uncle Mohammed Hassan was supposed to be the Minister of Internal Security in the first administration of Jomo Kenyatta. He resigned because of the war with the shifters, because he felt that he could talk to them. But Mr. Kenyatta thought that he could shoot them and that they would give up if he shot them. He had done the same thing with the Mau Mau in central Kenya. He had, disarmed them. His policy was the same British policy after independence. Even though he was the symbol of the independence movement, he did precisely the opposite when he came into power.
It was a terrible situation. The nomads lost their livestock, they were displaced. Many of them became refugees in neighboring countries, and they become a scattered community.
The attacks were on such a scale that their effect is still felt today.
Even now, many people who left the NFD region at that time have never been back. That's why you see a lot of Somali settlements in remote places like Bungoma, Namanga. If you talk to those people, they'll tell you, they don't say it, but they were IDPs, internally displaced people from, particularly from places like Mandera. Large number of people from Mandera were scattered. So it was a terrible catastrophe for the people of the region. And in fact, for this country as well, because we spent a lot of resources in dealing with the rebellion and with dealing with the conflict. And the region was left even far behind in terms of development, because nothing could happen for the first 10 to 15 years of the so-called shifter war.
Despite the nationalistic fervour, post-independence Somalia operated essentially as two separate entities, with different legal systems ensuring it could never operate as a cohesive nation-state. Within Kenya, ethnic Somalis created their own community, both in the border area and Nairobi's Eastleigh. They were often mistrusted by other ethnic groups, and their different religions set them apart from a predominantly Christian majority.
For many years, there was suspicion from, Somalians tend to block together. Who are these people? They speak different language, they're Muslim. Are they Arab or are they Africans? And if they are Africans, why can't they talk the same language? That was at the beginning.
Thus, by the mid-1960s, while most of Africa was in its honeymoon period of independence, the stage was set for conflict between the two countries that continues to this day. The European exit from East Africa left the local inhabitants ill-prepared for the new world that had been thrust upon them, dominated by the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States.